History holds its darkest secrets in silence, hidden behind redacted lines and locked vaults. For decades, entire events from the Second World War were buried under the weight of secrecy, too horrifying for the public to absorb. These were not the tales of open battlefields or heroic charges, but shadowed episodes erased by governments and intelligence agencies alike, filed away under classified and never to be released. As the smoke of war cleared in 1945, nations faced choices, whether to reveal the full cost of survival or to conceal the truths that might shatter fragile post-war order. Documents marked with faded seals, interrogation transcripts locked away in archives, eyewitness reports dismissed as propaganda, all whisper of events so disturbing they were deliberately hidden. The crimes of science, the betrayal of allies, the orchestration of massacres, the destruction of cities, each left behind fragments scattered in forgotten archives. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from declassified intelligence files, survivor testimonies, and evidence once condemned to oblivion. These are the disturbing World War II events censored because they were too terrifying to be known. Chapter 1. The Forbidden Experiments of Unit 731. In the vast frozen expanse of Manchuria, far from the prying eyes of international law, stood a facility that would become one of the darkest stains on human history. Officially titled the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, it bore the benign designation of Unit 731. Yet the name was nothing but a mask. Behind the walls of the complex, hidden near the city of Harbin, Japanese scientists conducted experiments that blurred every boundary of morality, medicine, and warfare. These were not trials carried out on animals or cadavers, but on living human beings, prisoners of war, political dissidents, Chinese villagers, Koreans, Mongolians, and even Russian captives swept into the abyss of the Imperial Japanese Army's occupation. Unit 731 was established in 1936, under the command of General Shiro Ishii, a medical officer whose obsession with biological warfare was equaled only by his zeal for imperial expansion. Ishii convinced his superiors that diseases could become the ultimate weapon. Silent, invisible, capable of crippling entire armies without the waste of bullets or shells. The Kwantung Army, always eager for any advantage against Chinese forces and wary of Soviet power along the border, gave him full authority. Soon, thousands of prisoners began to vanish into the labyrinth of laboratories, their identities erased from all record. Classified military documents referred to them only as marutas, meaning logs. In Ishii's system, human beings had been reduced to disposable experimental material. Inside the compound, men and women were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia. The victims lay strapped to cold steel tables, their chests cut open while their hearts still beat. Researchers observed the spread of diseases as lungs blackened, livers decayed, and blood vessels ruptured. Notes were meticulously kept, charts drawn, and photographs captured as the agony unfolded. Frostbite experiments were equally brutal. Prisoners were marched outside into the Manchurian winter, their limbs submerged in ice water until skin crystallized. When frostbite reached its peak, researchers would strike the frozen flesh with wooden bats, listening for the hollow sound that marked tissue death. Limbs were then thawed in boiling water, recording how long tissue would take to decompose. Many never survived the ordeal. Yet in the archives, each death was recorded not as a tragedy, but as data. The plague was another instrument in Ishii's arsenal. Captives were deliberately infected with Yersinia pestis, cholera, typhoid, and anthrax. Researchers observed the progression of disease, documenting the precise hour fever began, when organs failed, and the moment life left the body. Later, these pathogens were weaponized. Ceramic bombs filled with plague-infested fleas were dropped on Chinese villages, turning entire populations into living test subjects. Reports detail that outbreaks of bubonic plague in Ningbo and other regions were not natural accidents, but orchestrated acts of war. Eyewitnesses recalled entire towns sealed off, burning pyres of corpses stacked high under military supervision. As Ishii's team moved to their next test site, what makes Unit 731 particularly disturbing is not only the scope of its atrocities, but the silence that followed. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, Soviet forces quickly captured Manchuria and began investigating the site. They uncovered remnants of destroyed laboratories, scorched documents, and mass graves. Yet before complete evidence could be secured, the Americans intervened. Under orders from General Douglas MacArthur, US intelligence struck a secret deal with Ishii and his subordinates. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, the scientists would hand over their research. It was deemed too valuable to fall into Soviet hands. The reports on plague bombs, frostbite resilience, and pathogen weaponization were shipped to Fort Detrick in Maryland, home of the US biological warfare program. Victims, tens of thousands of them, were written off as collateral in the post-war race for supremacy. During the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, little mention of Unit 731 ever surfaced. While Nazi doctors at Nuremberg were hanged for human experimentation, Ishii and his staff quietly lived out their lives in Japan, some returning to prestigious medical careers. The truth of Unit 731 became buried in classified archives, only whispered about by survivors and a handful of investigators who dared to challenge the silence. For decades, the Japanese government denied or minimized the program, while US intelligence continued to guard the documents. It was not until the late 20th century that testimonies from former staff and victims began to break through the layers of suppression. Photographs, smuggled from the ruins of Harbin, revealed glass jars containing human remains, deformed skeletons, and preserved organs floating in formaldehyde. Journals found among discarded papers spoke of experiments completed successfully, where death was the final endpoint. Survivors recalled being injected with strange substances, sometimes with arms restrained while black liquid filled their veins. Children, women, and the elderly were not spared, as disease knows no boundary, and neither did Ishii's ambition. Even the destruction of evidence could not erase the whispers from the graves, scattered across Manchuria. One of the most chilling aspects is the cold detachment with which data was recorded. Charts marked Subject 34, male, age 27, infected with anthrax spores, death at 72 hours. No name, no identity, only a number. These were not isolated cases, but thousands upon thousands, meticulously catalogued as if human suffering were a scientific equation. To modern researchers, the ethical violations are beyond comprehension, yet within the logic of wartime desperation, the data was treated as treasure. It became the currency for immunity, a bargain struck in secret rooms where justice was sacrificed on the altar of national security. Today, the remnants of Unit 731's compound have been converted into a museum in Harbin, yet even there, much remains unexplored. Archival documents remain redacted, US files still locked under top secret, and testimonies fragmented by time. The full scale of the atrocities may never be known, as entire trainloads of documents were burned in the final days of the war. But the shadows they left tell enough. A program that weaponized disease, turned humans into experimental subjects, and was shielded by global powers who deemed truth too dangerous for public knowledge. Unit 731's existence challenges the very core of wartime morality. It is not merely a record of Japanese militarism, but also of Allied complicity. For in the end, the silence was not enforced by Tokyo alone, but by Washington and London, who feared what would happen if the evidence surfaced. What could have been a universal condemnation of biological warfare instead became a buried chapter, fueling Cold War research and ensuring the victims' voices were muted for decades. The forbidden experiments of Unit 731 remain a dark testament to how easily justice can be bartered away when nations value secrets more than truth. Chapter 2: Erased Massacre Beneath the Katyn Forest. In the spring of 1940, while Europe's attention was fixed on the German blitzkrieg advancing across Western Europe, an operation of cold calculation unfolded deep within Soviet territory. The setting was the quiet forests surrounding Smolensk, near a place called Katyn. It was here, under orders signed by Joseph Stalin and executed by Lavrenti Beria's NKVD, that one of the most chilling political massacres of the Second World War was carried out in complete secrecy. Nearly 22,000 Polish officers, intellectuals, priests, and prisoners of war, men who represented the cultural and military backbone of the Polish nation, were systematically executed. Their deaths were not the result of battle, but of bureaucratic decision, carefully documented in files marked top secret within the Kremlin. The victims were prisoners taken after the Soviet invasion of eastern Poland in September 1939, an invasion justified under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Thousands of Polish officers surrendered under the assumption they would be interned until hostilities ceased. Instead, they were dispersed across camps in Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Ostashkov, For months, families sent letters that went unanswered. Behind the walls of these camps, NKVD interrogators compiled lists. Each name was cross-referenced, recorded, and finally marked with a single chilling word: liquidate. This decision was formalized in March 1940, when the Politburo approved Beria's request to eliminate what the Soviet leadership termed counter-revolutionary elements. In reality, it was a deliberate attempt to cripple Poland's leadership class, ensuring the nation would be pliable under Soviet control. The executions themselves were carried out with industrial precision. Prisoners were transported under heavy guard to secluded sites such as the Katyn forest, Kalinin, and Kharkiv. There, in makeshift cellars or cleared pits in the woods, they were shot in the back of the head with pistols supplied by the Soviet secret police. Some were bound and gagged before execution. Others marched directly from prison cells to open graves. The process was efficient and unrelenting, with small groups brought forward one by one. Soviet officers kept detailed records, noting the hour, location, and name of each condemned man. By May 1940, the mass graves were filled and the paperwork filed, sealed within the archives of the NKVD. The massacre might have remained hidden forever, but in 1943, when German forces advanced into Soviet-occupied territory, they stumbled upon the graves in Katyn. Seeking propaganda material to drive a wedge between Poland and the Allies, the Nazis invited international investigators, including the Red Cross, to examine the site. Exhumations revealed thousands of bodies still wearing Polish uniforms, hands bound with rope, skulls punctured by single shots. Personal belongings, letters, diaries, identification papers, pointed directly to Soviet responsibility, as most items bore dates no later than spring 1940, well before the Germans had entered the region. The evidence was overwhelming, but geopolitics demanded silence. For the Polish government in exile in London, the discovery was devastating. They demanded accountability, but their calls were met with suspicion. The Soviets flatly denied responsibility, blaming the massacre on Nazi forces and launching a counter-propaganda campaign that branded the Polish accusations as treachery. When the Polish government refused to retract its statements, Stalin severed diplomatic ties, deepening Poland's isolation. To maintain the fragile alliance against Hitler, both Britain and the United States quietly accepted Moscow's narrative. Despite intelligence reports and testimonies that indicated otherwise, Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt, aware of Soviet complicity, nonetheless advised restraint. The truth was sacrificed for the unity of the coalition. This concealment continued into the post-war years. At the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi atrocities were laid bare, Katyn was briefly raised as evidence of German war crimes. Soviet prosecutors insisted the massacre had been carried out by German forces in 1941. Allied judges, unwilling to confront their Soviet partners, allowed the matter to fade into the background. The families of the dead were left in limbo, officially told their loved ones had been lost in combat or missing in action. In Poland itself, now under Soviet domination, even whispering the word Katyn could lead to imprisonment. The massacre became a forbidden subject, erased from textbooks, censored from newspapers, and replaced with the official Soviet version of events. It was not until decades later, during the twilight of the Cold War, that cracks in the wall of silence began to appear. Polish underground publications circulated forbidden testimonies from survivors of the camps who had been spared. Western intelligence agencies quietly amassed evidence, including reports from American and British prisoners of war who had been forced to witness the German exhumations in 1943. Still, governments hesitated to confront the Soviet Union directly, preferring to let the matter remain buried beneath layers of denial. Families of the victims formed clandestine associations, holding secret masses and vigils in defiance of state censorship, passing down the memory of Katyn from generation to generation. Finally, in 1990, under the pressure of reform and glasnost, the Soviet Union officially admitted responsibility. A statement issued by Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged that the NKVD had carried out the killings under Stalin's orders. Yet even this admission was partial. Key documents remained classified, including the so-called Beria Memo, the Politburo directive authorizing the massacre. These papers surfaced only later in the archives of Boris Yeltsin, who released them to the Polish government in the early 1990s. The documents confirmed what survivors and families had long known. Katyn was not an act of war, but a calculated extermination of a nation's elite. The significance of Katyn lies not only in the scale of the massacre, but in the decades of suppression that followed. It revealed the extent to which governments, even democratic ones, were willing to obscure the truth to preserve alliances. For nearly half a century, the voices of the dead were silenced, their story buried beneath propaganda and denial. Only when the Soviet Union itself began to collapse did fragments of truth finally surface. Even then, questions remained. How many more graves exist, still hidden in the forests of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus? How many documents remain sealed in intelligence archives, withheld under the excuse of national security? Today, the Katyn massacre stands as a symbol of both atrocity and erasure. It represents the deliberate destruction of a nation's leadership and the equally deliberate suppression of historical truth. The silence was not an accident, but a strategy, crafted in the corridors of power where alliances mattered more than justice. When one walks through the forest near Smolensk, the ground itself feels heavy, as though it remembers what the world tried so long to forget. Beneath those trees lie thousands of men whose voices were stolen, whose families were silenced, and whose story was twisted into propaganda. Their memory lingers not only as a tragedy of war, but as a warning. When truth is buried, history itself becomes the casualty. Chapter 3: Classified Nazi Nuclear Ambitions Erased. Amid the chaos of the Second World War, beyond the rubble of bombed-out cities and the smoke of mechanized battlefields, another war was unfolding in silence. This was a war not for territory, but for the power of the atom. While the Allies scrambled to unlock the destructive secrets of nuclear fission in their Manhattan Project, Nazi Germany quietly pursued its own atomic program, hidden under the innocuous name Uran Project. Directed by leading physicists such as Werner Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Kurt Diebner, the project sought to harness the immense power of uranium-235 and plutonium for the Reich. The official narrative, long repeated in history books, insists the Nazis never came close to success. Yet declassified files, intercepted communications, and testimonies from detained scientists suggest a far more troubling truth: that Germany's nuclear ambitions advanced further than the world was led to believe, and that much of this history was deliberately erased. The project began in earnest in 1939, after German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann successfully achieved nuclear fission in Berlin. Their findings, published just months before Hitler's invasion of Poland, triggered alarm across Europe. The possibility of weaponizing fission did not escape the notice of the Wehrmacht's Weapons Bureau. By April of that year, the Reich Research Council established the Uranium Club, bringing together some of Germany's most brilliant minds. Names like Heisenberg, who had won the Nobel Prize in 1932, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, a theoretical physicist of great repute, became central figures in the pursuit of the bomb. Laboratories sprang up in Leipzig, Berlin, and later in Haigerloch, where a makeshift reactor was hidden in a cave beneath a church. Uranium ore was gathered from mines in occupied Czechoslovakia and shipments from Belgium's Congo, smuggled through Europe under heavy guard. The research focused on two primary goals: developing a functioning nuclear reactor, which could serve as a stepping stone to plutonium production, and designing a bomb based on uranium enrichment. Experiments in Leipzig and Berlin attempted to create uranium machines, reactors moderated with heavy water or graphite. The Germans, however, faced significant obstacles. Supplies of heavy water were limited, largely because of Norwegian resistance sabotage of the Vemork hydroelectric plant in 1943, which crippled their access to this crucial resource. Graphite experiments also failed, in part because German scientists miscalculated its effectiveness as a moderator. Still, progress was made. Records show Heisenberg's team succeeded in achieving partial criticality in their Haigerloch reactor by early 1945. Declassified Allied intelligence reports confirm that uranium cubes, dozens of them, were suspended in arrays, cooled by heavy water, forming a rudimentary core. Though far from a weapon, it represented a disturbing step forward. The real mystery, however, lies in what remains obscured. Operation Alsos, the Allied mission to capture German nuclear research, swept across Europe in 1944 and 1945. Led by Colonel Boris Pasch and scientific director Samuel Gaudsmit, Alsos agents seized laboratories, documents, and personnel before they could fall into Soviet hands. What they uncovered shocked them. Crates of uranium oxide, centrifuge components, and reactor blueprints were found hidden in mines and bunkers. At the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, notebooks revealed extensive theoretical work on bomb design. In one chilling discovery, Alsos agents captured nearly 200 tons of uranium ore stored in Stassfurt, enough to fuel multiple reactors. Much of this material was quietly shipped to the United States, feeding the Manhattan Project at Oak Ridge. Official reports downplayed the significance, insisting the Germans had been years away from success. Yet fragments of seized documents suggest the gap was narrower than the public was told. Perhaps the most unsettling evidence comes from the farm hall transcripts. In July 1945, 10 captured German scientists, including Heisenberg, Hahn, and Weizsäcker, were secretly detained in an English manor house wired with hidden microphones. Their conversations were recorded in what became known as Operation Epsilon. When news of Hiroshima reached them on August 6th, the scientists reacted with astonishment, at least outwardly. Heisenberg claimed he did not believe it possible that the Allies had achieved a functioning bomb. Yet just days later, he delivered an impromptu lecture to his peers, outlining the exact theoretical calculations required for critical mass. His explanation, precise and detailed, raised suspicions. Had the Germans truly been ignorant of the bomb's feasibility, or had they deliberately understated their progress while in captivity? Historians still debate whether Heisenberg's astonishment was genuine or carefully staged to obscure how far their research had gone. Another layer of secrecy shrouds the possibility of German nuclear testing. Reports emerged in the late 1940s of strange explosions in Thuringia and along the Baltic coast, accompanied by unusual radiation sickness among local populations. Soviet intelligence records, some declassified after the Cold War, include testimonies from captured German officers describing special weapons tests in late 1944. While mainstream historians remain skeptical, the persistence of these accounts suggests something more than rumor. Could the Reich have attempted a crude nuclear detonation, or at least a large-scale radiological device? If so, the evidence was swiftly buried by both Western and Soviet powers, each eager to control the narrative of nuclear supremacy. The erasure of Germany's nuclear progress served multiple purposes. For the Allies, emphasizing Nazi failure reinforced the triumph of the Manhattan Project, portraying Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the inevitable result of American scientific genius. Acknowledging how close the Germans may have come would have undermined that narrative and fueled fears of what might have happened had the war lasted longer. For the Soviets, seizing German scientists and technology through Operation Osoaviakhim in 1946 became the cornerstone of their own atomic program. Publicly minimizing Nazi progress allowed both superpowers to claim nuclear supremacy without admitting how much they had relied on German research. Meanwhile, the scientists themselves returned to academic careers. Their wartime roles glossed over in sanitized biographies. The story of the Uran project, therefore, is not one of failure but of selective memory. Archives in Washington, Moscow, and Berlin still hold files stamped classified, containing reports from Alsos, transcripts from Farm Hall, and technical diagrams seized in 1945. What has been released hints at a chilling reality, that Nazi Germany stood closer to a nuclear weapon than we dare admit, and that the truth was deliberately buried in the early years of the Cold War. The fear was not only of what Germany had achieved, but of what the revelation might mean for global security. If one regime could come so close so quickly, then the nuclear age was far more precarious than the public was prepared to know. Today, visitors to Haigerloch can walk beneath the church where Heisenberg's reactor once stood, staring at the reconstructed lattice of uranium cubes. It appears almost benign, a relic of science gone astray. Yet behind those cold metal replicas lies the weight of suppressed history. Classified files, erased records, and silenced testimonies remind us that the Nazi nuclear program was not simply a footnote. It was a haunting near reality, a weapon that could have changed the course of history had it been completed in time. What remains uncertain is not whether Germany tried, but how close they came, and how much of that truth still lies hidden in archives marked for official eyes only. Chapter 4. Hidden Atrocities of Operation Keelhaul. In the closing months of World War II, as Europe crumbled under the collapse of the Reich and millions of displaced people struggled to survive, a secretive and little-known operation was set in motion by the victorious Allies. It bore the benign name of Operation Keelhaul, but beneath that title lay one of the most shameful episodes of forced repatriation in modern history. Conducted between 1944 and 1947, this operation saw millions of men, women, and children, former Soviet citizens, refugees, prisoners of war, and anti-communist fighters, delivered into the hands of Stalin's secret police, often against their will. Many of them had fled Soviet territory years earlier, some before the war even began, only to find themselves herded into camps, loaded onto trains, and forced back east to face interrogation, execution, or the endless cold of Siberian gulags. The background to Operation Keelhaul was the series of agreements forged during Allied conferences at Yalta and Tehran. In these meetings, where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin drew maps and divided territories, repatriation of prisoners was codified as a necessary measure for post-war stability. Article after article of these agreements specified that Soviet citizens were to be returned to their homeland, regardless of circumstances. On paper, the plan was presented as an orderly return of displaced persons. In reality, it became a system of betrayal. British and American troops, often disgusted by the orders they had been given, found themselves compelled to force terrified refugees into cattle cars or across guarded borders, knowing full well the fate that awaited them once they reached Soviet soil. The victims were not only soldiers who had fought under German command, such as the Cossacks who had fled Bolshevik persecution decades earlier, but also entire families who had escaped collectivization, famine, and Stalin's purges. One of the most infamous episodes occurred in May 1945 at Lienz in Austria, where tens of thousands of Cossacks and their families surrendered to the British, believing they would be granted asylum. Instead, under direct orders from higher command, they were betrayed. Officers were separated from their families under the pretense of administrative processing, marched into trucks, and handed over to Soviet agents. Many were executed within days. Their families, desperate and hysterical, resisted violently. Eyewitnesses describe scenes of chaos. Mothers throwing themselves and their children into rivers rather than face forced return. Soldiers using rifle butts to drive people onto trains, and entire groups attempting suicide en masse. The British soldiers present later admitted the events haunted them for life. Operation Keelhaul was not confined to Austria. Across Germany, Italy, and even the Balkans, Allied forces systematically rounded up displaced persons. In some cases, deception was used. Refugees were told they were being taken to new camps or resettled in safer territories, only to find themselves marched across bridges into Soviet-controlled zones. Intelligence reports note instances where individuals slashed their wrists, hanged themselves, or threw themselves under trucks rather than return. Yet the machinery of repatriation continued, justified in official records as implementation of Allied agreements. For the victims, these agreements meant only betrayal. Many had fought alongside Western units against Germany, serving as interpreters, guides, and even soldiers, believing their loyalty would earn them protection. Instead, they were labeled as Soviet citizens by bureaucratic decree and delivered into the hands of Stalin's enforcers. Once across the border, the fate of these repatriates was grim. NKVD officers conducted mass interrogations, sorting arrivals into categories: those to be shot immediately, those to be sent to forced labor camps, and those to be placed under surveillance. Former officers of the White Army, intellectuals, and anyone suspected of collaboration with the West were targeted most severely. Survivors later described cattle cars transporting thousands into Siberia, with little food or water, many dying along the way. In the gulags, repatriates joined millions already imprisoned under Stalin's regime, vanishing into the endless labor of mining, logging, and construction in some of the harshest climates on Earth. Few ever returned. To the Soviet state, they were traitors who had abandoned the motherland, and their suffering was hidden behind the Iron Curtain of secrecy. The Allies, for their part, buried the truth. Official reports were vague, couched in bureaucratic language that concealed the brutality of the operation. Orders given to British and American soldiers were classified, and complaints by officers disturbed by what they had seen were quietly suppressed. Those who questioned the morality of Operation Keelhaul were told it was a matter of international obligation, a phrase that masked the human cost. The public, exhausted by war, was never informed of the betrayal carried out in their name. In Britain and the United States, newspapers carried stories of victory, liberation, and rebuilding, while the deportations were kept off the record. It would be decades before the details began to surface. The operation continued until 1947, long after the guns of the war had fallen silent. Even as Cold War tensions began to rise, the repatriations went on, driven by the agreements made at Yalta. Only when Western officials finally realized the political damage it was causing did the process quietly stop. By then, millions had already been sent east, their fates sealed. For many families, letters stopped coming. Loved ones disappeared without a trace, their names erased from official registries, their lives swallowed by the machinery of Stalin's state. The silence was deafening, a void that generations carried with them. The moral weight of Operation Keelhaul remains heavy even today. It was a moment when victory against tyranny was followed by acts of betrayal, when the West chose expediency over humanity. Historians who uncovered the operation in the 1970s and 1980s described it as one of the greatest cover-ups of the war's aftermath. Survivors who managed to escape told harrowing stories, their voices trembling as they recalled being handed over by men wearing Allied uniforms, the same uniforms they had once trusted. Their memories were not just of loss, but of disbelief, that those who fought against oppression could commit such an act of enforced silence. What makes Operation Keelhaul particularly haunting is its deliberate obscurity. It was not a spontaneous act of cruelty, but an organized, multinational effort, concealed by layers of classification. Documents remained locked away in British and American archives for decades, stamped confidential and not to be released. Even today, some files remain inaccessible, their contents shielded under the guise of national security. The reasons are clear. To admit the full extent would be to acknowledge a betrayal at the highest levels, a stain on the legacy of victory in Europe. The victims became shadows, their names forgotten, their fate written only in secret reports buried in archives. For those who survived, Operation Keelhaul was not just a historical event but a lifelong wound. They carried the memory of forced betrayal, the sight of soldiers driving families into trains, the screams of those who resisted. These memories outlasted the war, the gulags, and even the fall of the Soviet Union. They remain as testimony to what happens when political agreements matter more than human lives, and when the truth is too disturbing for nations to admit. The atrocities of Operation Keelhaul remind us that the end of war does not always bring peace. It can also bring silence, betrayal, and the deliberate erasure of suffering from the pages of history. Chapter 5: The Disturbing Silence of Dresden. In February 1945, when Nazi Germany was already staggering toward defeat, one of the most controversial and haunting acts of the Second World War unfolded in the skies above Saxony. The city of Dresden, known more for its Baroque architecture, museums, and opera houses than for its military significance, became the target of one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in modern history. Over the course of 4 days, February 13th to 15th, the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces unleashed a storm of incendiary and high-explosive bombs that turned the Florence on the Elbe into a furnace. By the end of the raids, tens of thousands lay dead, entire districts were reduced to ash, and the city's cultural heart had been obliterated. For decades, official accounts minimized or justified what happened, but behind the silence lay a disturbing truth. Dresden was not bombed as a military necessity, but as an act of calculated terror. The operation began on the night of February 13th, 1945. RAF Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris, dispatched over 800 Lancaster bombers toward Dresden. They carried a deadly mixture: high-explosive bombs designed to blow apart buildings and infrastructure, followed by waves of incendiaries intended to ignite the ruins into uncontrollable fire. American bombers of the 8th Air Force followed with daylight raids, ensuring the flames never ceased. The timing was deliberate. Dresden was swollen with refugees fleeing from the east, as the Red Army advanced relentlessly toward Berlin. Eyewitness accounts describe streets overflowing with families dragging carts, children clinging to parents, the elderly stumbling in exhaustion. These were not hardened soldiers, but desperate civilians, trapped in a city thought to be relatively safe from destruction. When the first wave of bombs fell, panic spread instantly. Explosions shattered windows, collapsed roofs, and ruptured water mains. Then came the incendiaries. Magnesium and phosphorus rained down, setting fire to entire blocks within minutes. Survivors recalled the eerie glow that lit the night sky, followed by a roaring wind as the inferno created its own weather. Temperatures soared so high that asphalt bubbled on the streets and oxygen was sucked out of air raid shelters. Those who sought refuge underground suffocated as the firestorm consumed every breath. Others who tried to flee were caught in whirlwinds of flame, their clothes and skin ignited in seconds. The firestorm raged for hours, reducing entire neighborhoods to smoldering ruins. By the time the raids ended, Dresden's old town, with its centuries-old churches, palaces, and galleries, was nothing but rubble and ash. The death toll has long been the subject of dispute. Early German reports claimed over 200,000 dead, though post-war estimates placed the number between 25,000 and 100,000. What is certain is that the victims were overwhelmingly civilians, including countless refugees whose names were never recorded. Mass graves were dug hastily in the aftermath, with bodies stacked and burned to prevent disease. Photographs smuggled out of the city show blackened corpses lying in rows, mothers clutching children in death, men frozen in expressions of agony. Survivors' testimonies speak of screams echoing through the night, of rivers choked with bodies, of the overwhelming stench of burned flesh that lingered for weeks. It was, in every sense, a man-made apocalypse. The military justification for the attack has always been tenuous. Dresden had some factories and railways, but by February 1945, its strategic value was limited. German forces were already collapsing on every front. Internal British documents, later declassified, reveal that the raid was designed less to cripple industry than to break enemy morale, and to demonstrate Allied air power to the advancing Soviets. Churchill himself, in early communications, referred to the bombing as part of efforts to terrorize German cities into surrender. Yet when confronted with the scale of destruction, he distanced himself, calling the operation a serious query against the conduct of Allied bombing. The phrase terror bombing began circulating, but was quickly suppressed. Official narratives emphasized Dresden's role as a transport hub, carefully avoiding acknowledgement of the deliberate civilian targeting. The silence around Dresden deepened during the post-war years. At the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi atrocities were laid bare for the world, Dresden was barely mentioned. The Allies had no interest in drawing attention to their own actions, especially one that bore uncomfortable resemblance to the very crimes of indiscriminate bombing for which the Nazis were condemned. When survivors sought recognition or raised the issue, they were dismissed as pawns of revisionist propaganda. In East Germany, under Soviet control, Dresden's destruction was repurposed into a political symbol, not of Allied excess, but of Western barbarism, used to fuel Cold War propaganda. In the West, meanwhile, discussion of the bombing remained subdued, often reduced to footnotes in broader histories of the air war. Yet the truth lingered in the memories of those who lived through it. Survivors recounted not only the horror of the firestorm, but the silence that followed. They remembered being told to remain quiet, not to question the motives, not to compare Dresden's fate to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. But the comparisons were inevitable. Like those cities, Dresden had been chosen less for military necessity than for the psychological impact of destruction. Both attacks demonstrated the terrifying power of modern warfare unleashed without restraint. In Dresden's case, the silence was all the more disturbing because the perpetrators were not totalitarian regimes, but the democratic nations of Britain and America. Over the decades, historians gradually uncovered classified reports, internal memos, and survivor testimonies that painted a clearer picture. Documents revealed debates within Allied command, with some officers questioning the morality of targeting civilian centers so late in the war. Others justified it as a means of demonstrating force to the Soviets, a message written not in words, but in fire. The erasure of Dresden's true story was deliberate, a way to preserve the moral clarity of Allied victory. To admit that the firebombing of Dresden was an atrocity would have been to stain the image of liberation with the mark of terror. Today, the ruins of Dresden's Frauenkirche and other landmarks have been painstakingly rebuilt, stone by stone, from the rubble that once symbolized the city's annihilation. Yet even as tourists marvel at the restored skyline, the memory of February 1945 lingers like a shadow. Memorials stand quietly in corners of the city, bearing witness to those who perished in silence. But beyond the monuments lies an unspoken truth, that Dresden's destruction was not merely a tragedy of war, but a deliberate act that governments chose to bury under the rhetoric of victory. The disturbing silence of Dresden remains one of the most haunting examples of how history is written not only by the victors, but also by those willing to erase their own crimes. The war ended, but the silence did not. Long after the guns fell quiet in 1945, the most disturbing files remained locked away, hidden in archives and buried in state secrets. The experiments of Unit 731, the erasure of the Katyn massacre, the shadows of Nazi nuclear ambitions, the betrayal of Operation Keelhaul, and the firestorm of Dresden, all reveal a pattern of concealment. Nations that proclaim justice also practice silence, deciding what truths the public could bear and what horrors would be hidden under the guise of necessity. The Cold War only deepened this selective amnesia, as former enemies became allies and former crimes were traded for intelligence, technology, or political leverage. These events remind us that history is not only a record of what happened, but also of what was deliberately erased. As declassified files continue to surface, we are left with unsettling questions. How many more truths remain buried? What else was deemed too terrifying to reveal? And when the next sealed archive is opened, will we recognize the echoes of these forbidden histories?